Benny Lewis here from the Language Hacking Podcast, and this is episode 13, where we will be interviewing Idahosa Ness. I actually know Idahosa from online communities for quite some time. I came across him originally because I was quite impressed by his multilingual rap videos, and we'll be talking about his learning strategy of learning a language by ear with his mimic method. So this episode includes tips on using music and rap to learn language. It also covers how to sound more like a native, so you'll integrate into those cultures. This is something I really focused on when I lived in Brazil, and I've definitely seen Idahosa do it much better than most people I've ever come across. So before we get into the episode, if you've been enjoying it, make sure to leave us a review. Let us know what's been working for you. And you can do this at languagehacking.com/review. We read every single one. And a big thanks again to everyone who's left a review recently. It really makes a big difference and it helps us reach a much wider audience. So the links and resources mentioned in this episode will also be available at languagehacking.com/13. So without any further ado, let's go on to the Mimic Method interview with Idahosa Ness.
Welcome to the Language Hacking Podcast from Fluent in 3 Months.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Language Hacking Podcast. I'm with my co-host, Shannon.
Hello, I'm Shannon.
And today, we're joined by a friend of mine, Idahosa Ness. So, Idahosa, how's it going?
Oh, good, man. How you guys doing?
Very good. I would love to hear your version of how your language learning story got started. So could you give us the summary?
Ooh, the summary. Well, it started here in this bedroom, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, in the suburbs of America, where I was born and raised and dreaded every moment of my boredom. And all I could think about was just getting out. So somehow I finagled my teachers and my parents to let me go to Mexico when I was 17. And that was where I learned my first foreign language. And the story there was basically I went there, I was studying, learning how to read, write, conjugate, all the good stuff. And I was in a school program doing pretty well, but I was not able to really understand people. And I had a host family. I was by myself. No one spoke English, got super depressed and lonely. Then one day I just decided to try to forget about the grammar and the vocab and just mimic the people. I do Antonio Banderas impersonations and stuff when I would just be reading off of menus and things, just having fun with it. But through that process of paying really close attention to the sounds of things, really trying to get it, even the facial expressions, the hand movements. And after a few weeks of doing that, I had this major breakthrough and I became fluent very quickly after that. And then after that, I learned several other languages: Chinese, Portuguese, French, German, Italian. Yeah, it was after China and Brazil learning Portuguese and Chinese that I came up with my own I was developing my methodology and then kind of codified my own by then in 2011. And that's the mimic method.
So what exactly is the mimic method? What is the methodology that you came up with?
Yeah, I mean, the basic premise is that all learning is through mimicry. And so what it means to learn a language, if I'm going to learn French, for example, I'm not learning French, but really there's a group of people, we'll say in France or Cameroon or whatever, and they're moving their bodies in a certain way to communicate with each other, both from their hands, their faces, to their tongues and their lips and their throats. And that's moving the air that moves your ears, and they understand. So the essence of communication, the essence of learning is being able to imitate or to mimic other people. So I had realized that after my languages I had learned that when I got deep into the pronunciation, the accent, everything else opened up very quickly. And I also noticed that other people really struggled getting the nuances of accent and pronunciation. And I have a musical background. So basically I applied musical techniques to the teaching of the articulation of the tongue and of the lips. And now even in the face, we have facial expression courses. The idea that is the more you can move like them, the more you will naturally start to pick up on them and acquire the language. And it's quite simple. If I see someone making a sound while they're grabbing an apple, my mind will make the connection, be oh, that's the sound you make when you want to eat an apple, right? And then you mimic it and you just keep doing that until you're speaking the language.
Yeah, and you say you got this musical background that you've implemented into it. And a lot of language learners do have that. It gives them that little that edge of understanding musicality. But what I find most interesting about your background and your stories, I've seen videos of you actually rapping in other languages and doing a very convincing job of having what, at least to me, sounds like an almost native accent in the language. So this is, for me, by far the most impressive part of your language learning experience has been because of the sound mimicry that you really do end up sounding like a native speaker. So how did you take rap into it, and how did that develop in terms of like expanding on your skills and how you help other people learn through the likes of rap and music?
Yeah, sure. So, our whole thing is we teach you how to flow in any language. And I use that word flow in lots of different ways. One of them is actually the rap flow, or even the freestyle improvisational flow. And what happened was, actually, as a kid with my friends, we like freestyle rap a lot for fun, like download beats from Kazaa and freestyle in our basements. And it was something fun to do. And when I got to Brazil, it's learning my third language in Portuguese. And I picked it up very quickly because I learned the music of Brazilian music. So I fell in love with it. Once again, going deep into the phonetics and learning how to move your mouth in each way to the beat. And then, I was there at Brazil. I was speaking Portuguese very well. And then one night I was coming home from something and I stumbled upon a bunch of kids freestyling in the park, like 100 people freestyling in a park in Portuguese. So I jump in and once again, I speak Portuguese fluently by this point. And I'm like, let me show these guys how to do it. But then I was shocked because I was not able to freestyle at all in Portuguese. I was like, oh, wow, I can't think of a single word that rhymes with falar, and so then I'm like, what's going on here? So I went home and was really kind of trying to break it down and figure out how I could teach myself this. Started writing out kind of corny Portuguese raps for myself and making them better. And then I went in there each week and got better and better. And the interesting thing was that when you really push your mind to the edge to try to rap in a language, specifically freestyle rap in a language, when you come out of it and you have a normal conversation, it's like a walk in the park because you're just like, whoa, this is way easier. So anyways, the idea there is we brought it into our program. The first course we made was called The Flow of Spanish, and we taught you how to sing and even rap in Spanish. The idea being that even if it's rap and it sounds very complex, it's just a sequence of dance steps in your mouth. And if you break those down and put those to a beat, so, people would go through our program and our last kind of final boss song was this Daddy Yankee song. Was it? Lo que pasó, pasó. But then the actual lyrics, es una asesina, ella conlleva la medicina engañadora que te vuelve y te domina. And so we can take that and then slow it down using digital technology. And it's es una asesina, ella conlleva la medicina. And then we chunk that out into groups of 4. And then I'd be clapping it out for you una asesina. Right? And each of these sounds you can do, you just hadn't done them in that sequence. But you do it slow, build it piece by piece. And by the end of it, we've had hundreds of people go through and just rap in these Puerto Rican reggaeton songs, just like Daddy Yankee. And you don't have to know what it means. You have to know anything it means. But what you're doing is you're actually moving your tongue to speak the language naturally fast. So now when you go into a conversation, instead of getting tongue-tied because your tongues actually haven't learned those movements yet, now they've already done that, and all that kind of good stuff. So things start to flow much easier. And then that has all these downstream effects in terms of your confidence and your acquisition, your attention. So just as funny as it sounds with the rap, it really is the most effective way to train those movements in your mouth.
I'm also a musician. I'm a saxophone player, so I can totally relate to building the muscle memory, especially in your mouth, and get it to coordinate to create all of these sounds and things. And I'd love to know, especially because you have a musical background as well, what other sorts of things you've been able to take from music and apply to language learning beyond that muscle training. Yeah,
lots of things. So actually in our new programs, we break things down. So basically we teach you every single relevant aspect of the sound side of language. If language has 2 parts, fundamentally the sound and the meaning contained within the sound. The actual sound part, there's lots of things in the sound world. You can hear, birds chirping outside or a jackhammer going off. But in a phonology or a sound system, there's only 2 types for us humans. There's music and language. And what you're saying there is that there are certain elements of sound which come together in kind of pattern ways that interact with our mind in a way that's intelligible to us. So that breaks down into basically the rhythm right? So that's the kind of timing and the stress of things are going like this versus going like this. That's a rhythm. So I'm speaking Spanish and I'm like, hola, ¿qué tal, amigo? If I'm speaking Italian, like, hola, ¿qué tal, amigo? Right? Just in I just said Spanish words with Italian accent. And what I changed there was actually the timing of the syllables. So that rhythmic timing piece has the same basic rules to it from music, right? And then same thing, and my voice goes, that movement of tone is just, your voice box moving at different frequencies. So that's your intonation, that's your pitch, same thing you have in music. And then the final piece is, what am I actually doing with my tongue and the articulation? Fine motor articulation in your tongue and the learning of it goes by the same principles as we use to do it in our fingers playing saxophone or violin or piano. So yeah, actually, if you go deep, as I did, into like the neuroscience of it, what the conclusion they came looking at different scans of the brain when people are playing instruments or talking language is that we have shared learning mechanisms in our brains for the acquisition of musical systems as we do for the acquisition of language systems. So, beyond the actual practical use of music in terms of a way to train something repeatedly, we're actually on a neurological level touching lots of things that overlap. So there's a lot more going on there than I'll ever know in terms of how it helps, but I can feel it when I do my own language learning,
Yeah, and I've gone through your courses myself, and one thing I found absolutely fascinating is that I personally had a bit of an aversion to things like the International Phonetic Alphabet, and to me, it just looked like gobbledygook and these diagrams that they kind of have cross sections of the mouth. I had seen those before and I'd been put off by them. But you truly embrace all of these. And one thing that you do in terms of your recommendations with languages is you generally you wouldn't learn the words as they're written necessarily, because that involves some kind of a bias from our mother tongue. Is that right? And like, how do you take all of this technical know-how, because you said you've looked into the neuroscience of it, and how do you present that to the layperson who's just coming to this from the first, they're just seeing this for the first time?
Yeah, so I'll start that second question and weave into the first one. So the neuroscience stuff, all that kind of stuff, I'll sneak that in there because I like to nerd out on it, and like some segment of people do like to nerd out on it, but you don't need to know any of it. Like all you need to do is listen and mimic, watch and mimic. So the issue is that if I come and I bring you, once again, it's in French, and I bring you a French person and he starts speaking to the wheel, and he's like speaking super fast French, and you're just like, I can't catch any of this because I don't have any experience yet. So breaking that down into so small pieces I referred to earlier, and then presenting it to somebody piecemeal, that's just what teaching and learning is, right? Now, the problem is this: we already have a system, say in English or whatever your native language is, for mapping sound to script, to a visual symbol that we can like refer to later. So I can, put the letter T up on our video call here, and then in your mind, just when you see that, through no conscious effort of your own, a sound's going to emerge in your head, like, right? And then even a kind of sensory motor thing's going to happen in your tongue, where you're kind of licking the edge of your alveolar ridge as you start to flirt with the letter, right? So but here's the thing: if you were Brazilian, right, and you saw like it's like T-I, you're going to be looking at it, but you're not going to hear it. You're going to hear like a ch, right? Because that's just how they've mapped that same letter, that same script, to a different sound, a different movement in the mouth. So when you look at the grand scheme of things, and once again, I've learned 7 languages and I learned how to spell in all of them. So every sound I know, there's this web of like scripts associated to it. Imagine like the letter, like the sound floating above the earth with all these lines coming out with different like letters on each one. And it can be super confusing. So, in our earlier programs, once again, people record themselves and send us the recordings. And I'd listen to them and I hear people's mispronunciations. And there's 2 reasons why you can mispronounce. Either you just don't have that sound, or you're saying the wrong sound. And most mispronunciation actually, is people just saying the sound as they read it in their head. So just lots of noise in the signal. I've seen the letter T at least like 3 billion times in my life. So it's really hard to kind of unwire that association. So we use IPA just because we need something that has what they call 1-to-1 association. So every time you have a sound, you have this. And people see it, like you say, and they get freaked out. Like we see like aliens, runes, and we're like, oh my God, like new letters. but people learn it like in a couple of days because it's not about learning the letters. It's about learning the sounds, like hearing notes. I play music. I don't even know the names of the notes, but I can play music, right? So you don't need to know the letters to speak. So we just use IPA because we have to as a way to communicate things visually across the internet. But ideally, you wouldn't even have to learn that stuff. It would just be presented to you in pure audio.
For the method that you teach, a lot of it's for speaking and being able to produce the sounds, but I'm curious to know how it also helps with listening comprehension and being able to recognize the sounds.
Cool. Actually, I recommend a book I just finished reading called Mind in Motion by Barbara Tversky. And she kind of lays out the research for a point I like to make a lot, which is perception and production are not separate, fully separate in the mind. And actually, one of the main things you get from that book as they look at how the mind works is that we listen with our mouths. So if you notice when you're speaking to someone face to face or whatever, it's easier to understand them than like on the phone. You don't notice that until you learn a foreign language. You guys know like, oh, I speak Spanish, great. And then on the phone, you're like, oh my God, I'm back to square one, right? So like, that's what's going on. There's so much data going on. And it's because our minds are mimicking constantly. And we're kind of imagining ourselves making that movement with our mouth. And that's how we understand. So anyways, just by learning how to pronounce things, it instantly fundamentally affects your hearing. But of course, there's also a channel going the other way. We also train your hearing to affect your production, your pronunciation. So there's two things, right? There's the hearing or the actual perception of the sounds or the movements that the people are making. And then there's the, kind of collating those sounds with everything else in the context to make meaning out of it. And the problem is that, if we had a Zoom call right now and started chopping out now, like this, right? If I was talking that way, then you'd be like, oh, I'm not getting a clear signal. And that's kind of what it's like for people who are new to a sound system and they're trying to hear really fast, French, Chinese, whatever. It's literally like static. They're not actually catching all of the sounds. So once again, when you tune your mouth to it, you listen to audio very closely, side by side comparisons. What that does for your brain is it actually kind of tunes it like an antenna, like a radio dial into that frequency of that sound system. And then now you're just, you're finally getting the signal. So we have lots of people who are like intermediate speakers or even advanced speakers, but they just chronically struggled with listening comprehension. And then they'll do like the first module of our new program where all you do is we scramble syllables around in a phrase and then you have to kind of rearrange them. And they do that for like a week and they're like, whoa, like I listened to the radio today. It was the first time I understood everything they were saying. And so no new vocabulary was entered. They already had the words. It was just kind of, dialing the antennas and now they can actually receive the sounds.
It's a very interesting way of looking at it. And as people are like tuning their mouths, so a question I'm sure you get asked very often that I get asked too. I'm very curious to hear your answer. What do you say to people who as adults would say they cannot make these sounds that are different? If you think of something like the R in Spanish, and they may not have ever tried to do that before, and they believe it's just fossilized in their mouth, they'll never learn it. What would you say to them?
Oh, for that specific example, I would say just Google or YouTube my name, Chilled R, because there's a good video on that has like lots of comments of people like, oh my God, I got it. And because what it is like, because I couldn't do the R until I couldn't do the R until I was, 18 after I got back from Mexico. And my brother could do it. My mom could do it. I was like, oh, was that like some kind of genetic, reject? And I couldn't get the R sound. And it used to piss me off too, because in Mexico, my name was, for whatever reason, I chose the name Enrique. But at the time, I was like Enrique. And these Mexicans just could not understand me. Like, ¿Cómo te llamas? I'm like, Enrique. Mande? And Enrique. Mande? Oh, Enrique. I'm like, screw you, just rubbing it in now. And like, so I came back to the US and then I was just figuring out ways to like do it. And then one day it catches. So I explained that process in the video and then lots of people in the comments like, oh, wow, I got it now. But to the main point there is that it's a motor skill. It's a fine motor skill. If you sat down to piano for the first time and you tried playing like some Beethoven sonata and you couldn't get it, would you be like, oh, I'm never going to get it? Or would you be like, oh, no, actually, maybe there's a process called deliberate practice and training and I have to sleep and then wake up and do it again. And then I'll learn it. So to people who believe themselves to be genetically, physically, materially, reductionistly prevented from ever pronouncing a new sound in a new language, all I'd say to you is just try it longer. And then also try it the right way. You can't just, there's a lot of dead ends. So what I try to figure out in our own stuff is what is like the best path for each type of person with each type of error to get them to pronouncing the sound. And another final thing I say to that a lot is that, human beings are all very different. We look different hair, different skin color, but we all have the same mouth. So there's nothing that, someone can do with their mouth over there that I can't do with my mouth over here. It's just that they had more training if they grew up in it.
You just mentioned deliberate practice, and I think that's something that we should definitely kind of expand upon. For someone who might not know exactly what deliberate practice is, can you break it down?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, most of what we do, 99.9% of what we do moment to moment is our unconscious mind. So right now I'm not speaking to you. When I'm speaking to you, I'm not thinking about, okay, I need to put the blade of my tongue against the thing, blow my air through freaking, like I'm just doing it. It's just flowing out of me without any conscious effort. And that's because once again, I learned English as a baby and then it went into my subconscious. So the question is, how do you get things into your subconscious? And that's through your very narrow conscious window. So, you can use that conscious window to kind of scroll around on Facebook and like look at stuff and, get angry at your friend and ruminate about it. Or you can use it to focus, right? And if you focus on something and you put your body into it, you do it over and over and over again, then that attention gets burrowed into that corner of the world. And then it starts to put things into your unconscious, your motor memory, your mind, everything's going there. So that's a big fancy way to say, like, when you're practicing violin, for example, or saxophone, you're not just playing, you're not just flowing, you're sitting there and you're working on a very specific thing and you're doing a repetition over and over again until it gets embedded as a motor pattern. So that's deliberate practice really. And in the grand scheme of things, when I think about my language practice, there's basically two practices, my conversation practice and my deliberate practice. So conversation, what actually matters, if you're sitting here and you're trying to practice with somebody, you pay attention to the ways you get stuck, to the places that, I wanted to say this thing, I didn't sound good about it. But it's fine, just let it go, let it flow, but take note of it. And then afterwards, maybe later on your own, you'll kind of take those concepts like, oh, how do I talk in the past or whatever? Then you'll get sentences, you'll get whatever, and then you'll deliberate practice it. Our thing is musical. So whenever you do like that kind of song training thing we do in our programs, that's a deliberate practice where you're just repeating sounds and movements over and over again until it's part of you.
And as well as the deliberate practice in terms of the training aspect, what kind of interesting experiences have you had as you practice this with native speakers in your travels and online? And I'm sure you've probably gotten the comment many times that you sound like a native speaker. And how have you processed that? And how has that changed your experience as a traveler?
Yeah, I mean, I've had lots of interesting experiences related to that. So in each language I've mentioned, I've been mistaken for a native speaker. It's not something that happens. Like I can't like maintain it like a spy for like, years. It's I'll give it away like 60 seconds or whatever when I say something off. But in the beginning, they might make that assumption based on my pronunciation and accent. So it's funny in places like Brazil where I look super Brazilian and it's pretty bizarre at first because when I first learned the language, I do accent first. So when I got there, I was already speaking like Brazilian, even though I had a very limited vocabulary. So I'd walk into places and I'd be like, excuse me, what do you call this thing here? And I'm like pointing to a chair. And the guy, I'm saying it with a Brazilian, com licença, isso aqui, como é que chama? Sabe? And they're like, chair? You mean the chair? And they're like, chair? And then they think I'm messing with them. And then people get angry. Girls always thought I was like a Brazilian and I was just like pretending to be American and they wouldn't trust me. So it was like this weird uncanny value. Well, I wasn't good enough to speak full Portuguese, but my accent was like that no one believed me. So I had experiences like that. People would demand to see my passport in like Brazil, like, "Você não é americano." And like, and then, but then on the other side, like in China, where I don't look Chinese, but on the phone, I get away with it. And then I remember one time I like was looking for an apartment to rent. And then I was like haggling really hard in Chinese on the phone. And then I show up at the place and she's expecting to see some Chinese guy. And then like, just like her face when I open the door, she's like, wait, what? And like, so yeah, but the cool thing is even like a place like China, our sense of other and self, we tend to focus on the visual side of that. Like, oh, he's a different ethnicity. He wears different clothing, et cetera, et cetera. And we think that's the big deal. But in my opinion, or in my experience, what really makes people feel like they know you or they know you know them, is if you can sound like them, if you can move like them. If you can walk into the party, you can be like, Irish, you can go to like a party like in Uganda and they're like, hey, and then if you just start breaking down and doing their dance and like speaking with their accent, they're like, hey, he's one of us, and we've seen people like that in our travels lots of times. People are just so deeply embedded in the culture, even though they stand out maybe visually, because they move with like them, they sound like them. People really react to you differently. A lot of these countries that stereotypically would be, they hate like Americans or foreigners when they speak, blah, blah, blah. But because I can sound like them, they'll make those jokes in front of me. I'm like, I'm American, right? They're like, yeah, but you're different. You're not like, So that's another major benefit of really focusing on the accent, is that there is a major difference in how people respond to you when you can really sound like them.
That's really interesting, because I feel like a lot of learners, what they want to do is they want to focus on vocabulary and grammar and really dig into that. And they feel like they need to speak perfectly, as opposed to like not worrying so much about the perfection, but maybe more like the immersion, like you were mentioning. And what would your advice be to someone who is thinking that they need to speak perfectly and know all the grammar and all the vocabulary before they really start to focus on the other aspects?
Yeah, my advice is don't do that. That's my first advice. But going deeper into it, like I said, our thing is we want you to flow in any language, and part of flow is being able to creatively express yourself in the moment without allowing your inner editor or inner critic to get in the way. So that's one of I think the biggest challenge language learners have, is overcoming that inner critic, especially because of our academic background, how we really trained this perfectionist mentality. And every time you didn't put an accent over the A in whatever language, there's a big red letter that traumatizes you middle of the night and whatnot. So, letting go of that is a big thing I've been focusing on, is how do you actually train people to shut that part of their brain off? Once again, music has an important role to play there. First off, if you actually philosophically believe that you need to perfect things before you do it, it's just not going to work. It's just not how, once again, I can't just sit here and watch somebody do like a double backflip and like study it with my glaring eyes for 4 months. Then like, okay, I got this. And then do it. I have to fall on my face a bunch of times. That's just how motor skills work. They have to be learned through messing up and fooling around. So yeah, that's that. But I don't think most people truly believe that. It's more of like the actual anxiety and fear of the feeling of it. My main kind of advice for those things to people recently is this idea of selecting your game wisely. So what happens is most people are like, the game I play when I'm on my italki session is I need to speak perfect French. And each time I don't sound perfect, I've lost, the game over. But a different game might be like, I don't care if I get the grammar wrong or if I use the weird words. I just want this guy to nod his head as if he knows what I'm talking about by whatever means necessary, right? And then when you get that, and those of us who've had it know that feeling of a new language, and you say something and the guy's like, oh yeah, I know what you're saying. You're like, oh yes, I successfully communicated to another human being in a different language. That is really what it's about. So what I try to encourage people to do is our sound stuff and our things is kind of have fun with it, and also put your sights on a goal that's actually meaningful and attainable. Because you need to have the positive emotion of achieving something in order to keep moving forward. There's no such thing as perfect. Like I probably made a bunch of mistakes in my English in this call already, but no one notices because no one cares. So just really just focus on the essentials and fundamentals of just trying to connect with another human being, and and use all the tools you have for that, such as your hands, your face, your voice, everything.
Flow is just so central to everything that you talk about. So when it comes to like a basic question that we would get asked a lot of as language learners, as what does fluency mean to you? Generally, I would just pick a European Common Framework level. But I think in your case, it's harder to pin it down like that, because it feels like you get this level of flow before you have, like even when you're in the A levels of the language, before you have even basic vocabulary like chair, that you can have a certain flow in your language. So what to you would be the definition of fluency?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, all these words come from the same root, right? Flow, fluency, fluid. And you can think about what the opposite of that is, which is kind of like blocked, stalled, so stuck. This is the words that people actually use all the time to describe where they are in their language learning, not just from how they are in conversation, but also in their moving forward and progressing. They feel stuck. And so for me, the main objective of our school is to put people into flow. And that's both when you're in a conversation with someone and your deep human desire to connect with them and explain and learn all that kind of stuff isn't blocked by something as silly as, a language, and then you're able to connect, you're able to express yourself. And then each time you have that conversation, you walk away knowing more about that person, knowing more about their culture, knowing a new word, knowing a new way of speaking, and then you then integrate that into your next conversation, and each one you get better and better and better and better. So you're flowing forward there. And then each conversation is flowing more. So you're connecting more and more. So for me, when I talk about fluency, I'm personally really thinking about getting to that point when the whole language endeavor stops sucking and you're not like, just being embarrassed all the time, but you're actually able to increasingly get to know. So when I'm in a place, and I get to that flow point, I'm getting better and better and better with each conversation and getting closer and closer and closer with the people and the culture. And I'm noticing different improvements along the way, but I'm also kind of not. So yeah, there's definitely a way you can technically define it, but at the end of the day, that's all arbitrary. On the individual level, what you're looking for is to not have that feeling of being stuck in conversation and stuck in your progress. So I would really encourage people to not obsess so much over like, I have to be perfect. I have to have the National Academy of Sciences to approve my fluency. And it's like, for me, it's like a language is a tool fundamentally. It's a cool tool. I like to sit down and dissect it from time to time and learn about it. But really it's a tool and I'm using it to connect with other human beings. So as long as you're doing that, you're winning.
So we've talked a lot about sounds, accent, pronunciation, both for production and recognizing. And you said that you focus on that initially, but I'm curious about what happens for you personally after. What do you do to gain the vocabulary and the grammar that you need?
Sure. Yeah. So the very first thing I do when I learn a language is I become a mimic and in that language. And it would be a few weeks of deliberate practice on the rhythm, the melody, and the specific phonemes, the combination of those phonemes, every single possible syllable I'm able to pronounce them in different phrases, got different songs. And through that process, we do it very systematically. So it only takes a few weeks. I'm now able to arrive in said country or have a conversation with a speaker of said language and listen to them speaking at their normal speed, capture, 5 to 8 syllables of it, because that's the limit of what I can do, and then hold it in my mind and mimic it, right? So then I walk in and somebody points and I point to something. I'm like, hey, what string of syllables do you guys use to refer to this? And they're like, budagabuku. And I'm like, okay, budagabuku. Now, if I hadn't done that initial training, all I would hear was, right? I'd hear nothing. And I give the example a lot to people. If I say to you to mimic this phrase, Ferdigan Razo Wugwali. Try it.
Ferdigan Wazo Woodwooly.
That's good enough for it.
Ferdigan Wazo Woodworry.
There you go. So both of you are like 90-95% there on your first try. Now let's see if you can get that same percentage on this one. Agriat Musagbi. Shannon's eyeballs, I think, doubled in size.
I'm good.
Exactly, right? So it's actually the same amount of data, technically. It's the same length of syllables. That was from my mom's native language. And but it was composed of sounds that your brains haven't adapted to yet, right? And but the first one, Ferdigan Razo Wugwali, those are all sounds that it doesn't make any sense, but the syllables and the intonation and all the other acoustic patterns are familiar. So now imagine if I associated Ferdigan Razo Wugwali with a thing, and I was like, hey guys, this is my Ferdigan Razo Wugwali. And you might not remember it the first few times, but after a few tries, you'd be like, okay, boom, association made. Next time I want Idahousa to pass me that thing, I'm like, hey, Idahousa, pass me the Ferdigan Razo Wugwali. But you couldn't do that with Agriat Musagbi because there's no kind of storage unit you could use with it. So to answer your question, once I have that if I have conversation with people, just the mere act of asking, how do I say this, and mimicking, and then watching people lots. And then, you know, you can do like kind of programs like, you know, Pimsleur and stuff like that, and it will accelerate the acquisition of like the kind of core pieces. You can see them quicker, and there are ways you can accelerate it. But really, that's just a speed question. If you just do the process of watching and mimicking, listening and mimicking, watching and mimicking, and putting yourself into the situation, you just slowly acquire things. The problem is if you hadn't done that, then you're not going to get the data in. So yeah, so people ask me that question a lot, like, how do I learn afterwards? I'm like, the mimic method. I just mimic people. And of course you have the psychology of being okay with, you know, saying things completely wrong for a long period of time. You know, I'm just stringing words together and I'm like, you know, cat downstairs, eat now. Yes. You know, but once again, I'm winning the game, but they're nodding their head and they're kind of like, oh, he means this. So through that process, I'm constantly refining the language through mimicry, because now I get to a point where I can communicate very basically, like caveman style, like Benny calls it. And then, but then someone says something, I know what they mean. And in my own mind, I'm like, oh, that's how you say that. Like, and then I mimic that. And then now, boom, I used to be able to communicate that, but now I can actually say it exactly how they say it. And then next time I hear it again, is another extra nuance of like a deeper grammar piece that wasn't available to me at the very beginning, but now it is. So it's like, you know, printers, they do things like when you print out like a painting or a picture, for example, it's like line by line. But when a painter paints, they don't do it line by line, right? They do the sketch first and then they do like the things on top and layer. So yeah, just by layer, you're just mimicking enough to become more communicative.
And as well as that, helping your own learning process, you've certainly helped a lot to train a lot of people in improving their mimicry skills. And you've helped me in the past by using the likes of SoundCloud and actually pinpointing specific timestamps in an audio that I might have sent to give me feedback on how I can improve upon that. I'm curious what else you have to say about how you train other people specifically with their issues.
Yeah, it gets back to that deliberate practice question. In a really effective training regime, there's immediate feedback and there's a sense, you know, you try to mimic the movement, but you're going to be off the first time. You know, your tongue's here, but it's supposed to be here on a little bit to the left or whatever. So in our first program, the way we dealt with that was, and that's what we do with you, Benny, is you record yourself trying to mimic your target, aka trying to replicate his movements the same way. And there's going to be discrepancies. There's a point that's off. Now, I had gone so deep down the rabbit hole on this stuff that I can now, listening to anyone speak anything, like pause the screen and tell you exactly how your tongue is positioned in your mouth at that moment, because I've heard tens of thousands of audio recordings of people. So what I would do is I'd go in on SoundCloud, which allows you to put a comment on a specific second. And then you're saying like, tu, and in Spanish, like tu. And then, but it's actually, oh, you're using the tip of your tongue instead of the blade of your tongue to articulate the tu, right? And then there's a little video of me explaining it in like a minute. And then you see it and you're like, oh, all right. And then boom, we've now reduced the language of a million words and a million different things to a single, like, move your tongue a little bit more forward. And then it sounds like a very trivial thing, except for that t sound is going to show up every 3 seconds in the language. And so now you're actually starting to flow with it. So we've retired that me giving feedback thing, but in the new thing we're creating, we're reintegrating that feedback system into it, because people really like it and it really is useful. But otherwise, the best you can do is self-record or get other people to help you out. And then if you can kind of go on your own search of where am I off, and then what I really want people to encourage people to do is to pay more attention to what's going on there. And when you do that, you just start to discover things on your own and correct things on your own. And it's actually a very fun and interesting adventure to go deep into nuance on sound, because it's so ubiquitous. So you hear it everywhere. And you're like, oh yeah, like, wow. Like people listening right now are going to be like, well, I guess in Spanish you do use it, the blade of your tongue to go to and not to. Oh my God. So, that's how we do it.
One of the questions that we like to ask all of the guests on the podcast, since this is the language hacking podcast, is what is language hacking to you?
Hacking is about, at least in this context, is about getting to a goal as efficiently and quickly as possible. So I guess what I could say is what language hacking is to me, and what I try to communicate a lot in my messaging to people is to be really clear on what your goal is. And like I said earlier, I sometimes feel the focus is too much on the language itself, which it could be for some people, but I think most people, their core motivations for setting out to learn a language is because there's usually some specific person or some specific culture that they want to get to know on a more intimate level for whatever reason. And that is the goal, right? So the question is, how do you hack your way to that goal as quickly as possible? And when you ask that question, you might be like, I just spent the last 6 hours studying a genitive case in German, and yet I have, no friends in Germany yet. I came to this country because I want to make friends. Am I really hacking my way to the goal right now? Or have I hacked my way into the middle of the jungle, right? So really getting clear on the goal. And that's what it is for me. It's being like, I've learned a language for like an ex-girlfriend before, and it was a very kind of clear goal. So hacking for me is about getting clear on it, looking for ideas, but also integrating your own and being creative with it, and then having fun with it, and then just flowing towards it. So that's really, you're hacking well when you're flowing.
Yeah, absolutely. And as we've referred to a few times in this interview, and as I personally stated, I've really found your products so interesting. So I'd like to give you a chance to just tell people what kind of stuff do you work on that they may want to check out. And of course, I'll make sure to share the links in the show notes so people can go over there. What stuff do you have that people can check out?
So you go to mimicmethod.com and we have our courses there. We're actually very soon shifting to a new model, a recurring model, where you can come in and have access to all our library of courses. And then we have another community as well for that. But yeah, basically it's a bunch of courses I make on, first and foremost, the rhythm of a language, the melody of a language, the articulation, the 39 elemental sounds of Spanish, the 56 elemental sounds of German. What is each and every sound someone makes? How do you move your tongue and lips to produce that sound? Then we have content that's musical based. In order for you to get that motor memory and that flow going, kind of saying syllables, musical syllables over and over again, and then getting a flow, memorizing songs. I also have a program on there on facial expression science. So the same way I can tell you about the articulation of your tongue, I can now also see what's going on in the face. And when you learn that stuff, it goes crazy. And all of a sudden, not only do your language learning skills go way better, but you're way better with your relationships and all kinds of stuff too. So really what I'm passionate about fundamentally is communication and relationships. So we're opening up soon our program so that you just come in there and just have a membership and you can play any of those games that you want. So yeah, if you come to our site, join the list, you'll be informed of all the cool things we got going on. mimicmethod.com.
Yep, I'll make sure to leave that link in the description, the show notes for this episode. And this has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you very much, Idahosa.
Yes, thank you so much. And just out of curiosity, what are your personal current language projects before we wrap up? I'm in between ones right now. I'm kind of focusing more on teaching.
But one that I've been dabbling with is actually increasing my freestyle rap abilities in different languages. I'm terrible in most languages, but I have this new process that helps you. Oh, in our programs, by the way, we have one that actually specifically teaches you how to freestyle in a language, even if you have zero experience with it. So if you want to do that, come check us out. But yeah, that's what I've been working on a lot recently. Just kind of like the more musical side of things and having fun with it again.
Excellent. So thank you very much again. And we'll be sure to share all the links with people. And otherwise, I'll wish everybody a happy language learning until the next episode.
Thanks, guys. Happy language learning.
Happy language learning.
At the end of each episode, we would like to share an actionable takeaway with you. In this episode, Idahosa shares one key way to make sure you stay on track with your learning goals and hack your language learning. What was Idahosa's tip? Keep your language goal in mind as you're learning. Doing work that leads you directly to that goal will get you there faster and help you stay motivated. So for example, if your goal is chatting with your friends in German, drowning yourself in grammatical features like cases won't get you there. Redirect your attention. What about you? How do you quickly reach your language learning goals? Let me know at languagehacking.com/13. And finally, if you're enjoying the podcast and would like to support it, then there's no better way than by signing up for the Fluent in 3 Months Challenge, where you'll have a 15-minute conversation in a new language after just 90 days. You can find more details about that at fluentin3months.com/challenge.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Language Hacking Podcast. Subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you found this episode valuable and want to help us out, please leave a review at languagehacking.com/review. The Language Hacking Podcast is presented by Lewis and Shannon Kennedy and produced by David Sobel, with special thanks to the Fluent in 3 Months team. The theme music was written and performed by Shannon Kennedy. Find the show notes at languagehacking.com/podcast. Thanks for listening and happy language learning.